That's all the rancher had planned when he rode into that dust-choked town. A quick deal. No words, no people. Just back to his quiet land where the wind didn't ask questions and the earth didn't judge. But the crowd gathering near the saloon pulled his gaze. Laughter, spitting, boots scraping wood. Something ugly was happening. Then he saw her. She was kneeling on a wooden platform like discarded cargo, wrists tied with frayed rope, a weather-beaten sign swinging beside her. $1. Take or leave. No name, no voice, just eyes, muddy and fireless, staring somewhere far beyond them all. People mocked her, some looked away. Others said she was used up, too far gone. A man in the crowd shouted, "You'd get more from buying a dog?" And still, she didn't flinch. She just knelt there, as if the world had already passed her by. But not him. The rancher stepped forward. Didn't ask her name. Didn't ask what she'd done or who she was. He just reached into his coat pocket and laid a silver dollar on the auction table. The crowd chuckled. The auctioneer hesitated. "Serious?" "She yours," he replied, voice low. "She's human, ain't she?" And for the first time, she blinked. Not in fear, but like someone realizing she was being seen. Not for what she'd been through, but for the person she might still become. She didn't speak a single word on the ride back to the ranch. Not when he untied her wrists, not when he handed her a canteen, not even when he offered her the back of his coat against the evening chill. The sun had dipped behind the hills by the time they reached the gate, painting the sky in blood orange and regret. She sat stiff in the saddle, clutching the reins like they might disappear. Like she still wasn't sure this wasn't another trick. The rancher didn't talk either. He just opened the gate and led the way home. Home. That word felt too big for where they were headed. Still, it was the first place in years where no one looked at her like she was a problem to be solved or a body to be used. He showed her to the barn. It wasn't much, just hay, tools, and the scent of wood and soil. He rolled out a blanket in the loft and left her a small oil lamp. Then he handed her a folded note with 4 words scratched in pencil. "You can stay here." No signature, no rules, just space. And God, how long had it been since she'd had that? The next few days passed like fog. She rose before dawn, worked without being asked. She hauled water, swept the porch, fed the animals. Not because he expected it, he never said a word, but because the silence between them didn't feel cold. It felt safe. He never locked the doors, never asked her what happened. He never even touched her shoulder when passing by. He just nodded when she handed him nails while he fixed a broken fence, or said thank you when she brought him coffee in a chipped mug with 2 hands. But the strangest part? He never looked at her like she was broken. He looked at her like she was there. That was all. On the 7th morning, she finally asked, "Why'd you buy me?" It slipped out like a whisper, raw and unfinished. The rancher paused. Then he set down the saddle he'd been oiling, looked out toward the hills and said, "Because no one else did." She waited, thinking he'd add more. Justify it. Frame it in pity or guilt. But he didn't. He just said it plain like it didn't need dressing up. Then he looked at her, really looked, and said something that cracked the walls inside her. "I once had a daughter. She never made it home from the war." That was all he gave her. No tears, no names. Just that one sentence like a lantern set down gently in the dark. And for the first time since she could remember, she cried. By the 2nd week, she started to hum when sweeping the porch. Nothing fancy, just sounds she barely knew were still inside her. On the 3rd week, she told him her name, or the name she chose for herself. Etta. He said it once like tasting it. Etta. Then tipped his hat. She smiled. It wasn't love yet. It wasn't even healing. But it was something sacred. 2 wounded souls rebuilding a world with no blueprints, just kindness and time. And maybe, just maybe, that's all a person needs. Not to be rescued like a prize. Not to be punished for what they survived. Just to be seen. To be given space. To be called by a name, not a price. If this story moved you, even just a little, like this video to help it reach someone who might need it. Subscribe to our channel for more Wild West tales that echo with justice, dignity, and second chances. And if you believe people deserve more than what the world priced them at, share this story. Because somewhere out there, someone still needs to be seen. The town started to notice. They always did. Quiet places have loud eyes, especially when a man who'd lived more like a ghost for the last 5 years started showing up in daylight with someone beside him. At first, they whispered. Then they speculated. Was she hired help? A trade? A burden he took in out of guilt? No one dared ask the rancher directly. And if they looked too long, he'd look right back until they found something else to stare at. But Etta noticed. She noticed the way women stiffened when she walked past with a bucket of flour. The way men spoke to him as if she weren't standing right there. Most days, she kept her head down and said nothing. But not out of fear anymore. She had simply grown used to measuring her worth in silence. Until the day she didn't. It was the monthly market, small but crowded, and she had asked to come. He didn't hesitate, just hitched the wagon and handed her a hat. The wind kicked up dust as they arrived. She helped carry bundles. She spoke to the baker's wife. She offered a little boy a piece of dried apple while his mother wasn't looking. Then came the tailor's daughter. "You're the one he bought," the girl said, eyes narrowed like slits of judgment. "How much did he pay for you? Must have been less than a mule." The words hit like an old bruise pressed too hard. But Etta didn't flinch. She simply turned toward the girl and replied, voice steady, "I cost $1. But he never asked for change." The market went quiet. The rancher, who'd been sorting feed nearby, looked up. She didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. That night, they ate stew by lamplight. The old table between them had once felt like a wall. Now it felt like shared shelter. "Good comeback," he said, breaking a piece of cornbread. She smiled, spooning lentils. Felt good. He didn't say anything for a moment, then added, "You know, that's the first time you've answered someone like that." She didn't meet his eyes. "That's the first time I thought I could." The days that followed were small but vivid. She stitched a tear in his coat. He let her paint the fence lilac gray, not a Western color, but she said it reminded her of dusk. He didn't question it. One morning, she found a box on the porch. Inside was a brush, a small mirror, and a folded note. "In case you forgot you're still a woman." There was no signature. She knew who left it. She stared at the brush for a long time. Then she brushed her hair for the first time in years, but not every moment was a victory. There were nights she still bolted awake, breathing fast, heart racing. Nights when the wind reminded her of slamming doors, or when thunder sounded too much like men's laughter. One night she stood outside in the rain, bare feet in mud, trembling with rage she couldn't name. The rancher stepped onto the porch, saw her soaked and shaking, and asked, "Want me to come out there?" She didn't answer, so he sat down on the steps and stayed. Not beside her, not touching, just there. Eventually she came in, wrapped herself in a wool blanket, and fell asleep by the fire. He never asked her what it had been about. She never had to explain. The healing didn't happen in grand gestures. It happened in teaspoons. In a second cup of coffee poured without being asked. In a fence fixed together without words. In the quiet knowledge that she was not being watched, but witnessed. And when winter came, the ranch felt different. Not warmer, exactly, but less hollow. She'd added curtains to the windows, sewn from old flour sacks. Brought wildflowers home from the creek and set them in a chipped mason jar. Made stew with her own touch. More garlic, fewer rules. One evening, after supper, he said, "You've made this place livable again." She looked around, then looked at him. "No," she said softly. "You made it survivable. I made it mine." On the first snow, she walked outside alone. The wind was biting, but she held her head up. There was a little grave near the fence line, his daughter's, she assumed. She knelt beside it and placed a string of prairie blooms she'd been drying for weeks. "Thank you," she whispered. Not to the grave, not to the rancher, but to the space that let her return without pressure, to the silence that never judged her. And maybe, to the girl she once was, who had waited patiently in the corner of her soul for this very kind of moment. She was never told to be anyone here. She was simply given space to remember who she still was. The first time Etta touched the piano, she didn't mean to. It was just there, in the corner of the parlor, dusty, forgotten, a little out of tune like her own voice. She had been wiping the windows when her hand brushed the keys. Just one note, faint and off-pitch. But it rang through her like something older than memory. She stood there, alone in that quiet room, eyes fixed on the ivory she didn't feel worthy of touching again. Then she pressed another key. Then another. Not a song, just sound. But it was enough to stir something loose in her chest. The rancher was out chopping wood. She knew he wouldn't hear. And still, when she sat down and let her fingers drift, awkward, hesitant, it felt like someone was watching. Not with suspicion, but with hope. Since she'd arrived, time had unfolded differently. It wasn't marked by days or months, but by small, irreversible changes. The first time she left her boots by the door. The first time she used her name without flinching. The first time she looked in the mirror and didn't turn away. He never commented on those things, but he noticed. One evening, as they shelled beans by lantern light, he said quietly, "There's light in your eyes now." Etta paused, surprised. She hadn't realized it. But when she thought about it, she didn't wake up afraid every morning anymore. The silence no longer echoed with old screams. She was beginning to exist without apology. She looked at him. "I think it's yours, some of it." He shook his head slowly. "You just needed someone not to steal it." The townspeople remained wary. A woman like her, tied to a man like him, was bound to stir questions. Some wondered if he'd gone soft. Others whispered he was trying to replace his dead daughter. But Etta didn't flinch anymore. She was learning that some people only feel powerful when they make others small. One morning at the general store, a ranch wife muttered under her breath as Etta passed, "Poor thing, rescued, but still used." Etta turned, slow and calm. "No one uses me," she said. "Not anymore." The rancher had heard. He was at the other end of the store, listening. But again, he said nothing. He didn't need to. She had answered for herself. One night, during the first snow, they sat on the porch with mugs of coffee warming their hands. Silence hung between them, not awkward, not empty. Just stillness with a heartbeat. She asked, "Did you think I'd stay?" He looked at her. "Number. But I hoped you'd want to." "I did," she said after a long pause, "but not because you saved me. Because you didn't own me." The wind blew soft over the land. The barn creaked in the distance. She tucked her knees to her chest, sipped her drink. Then she said something she hadn't even told herself until that moment. "I used to think I was ruined." He didn't interrupt. Like I'd been turned into something no one would ever look at without shame. His eyes stayed steady on the horizon. "I didn't know you could still be wanted without being claimed. Or that you could be safe without being locked up." The rancher turned toward her then, slow and sure. "You were never ruined," he said. "You were just waiting for someone to stop calling you broken." Winter moved in with quiet insistence. She learned to patch coats, to salt the steps, to stack wood in neat rows against the frost. He taught her how to sharpen a blade, how to check for wolves in the distance without panic. In return, she taught him how to laugh again. Not loud, just those small huffs of breath when something caught him off guard. One evening, she made biscuits. Burnt the first batch, laughed so hard she almost cried. He said they tasted like charcoal, ate 3 anyway. She called him stubborn. He called her home. Then, without planning, she brought out a small journal. The pages were worn, the writing inside faded but still legible. "This is mine," she said. "What I wrote, before." He looked at it, then back at her. "You want me to read it?" "No," she said, holding it close. "I want you to know it exists." He nodded, said nothing more. But that was enough. Just knowing someone else knew, without demand, without invasion, was a kind of healing she hadn't dared imagine. Etta wasn't trying to become someone else. She wasn't rebuilding from scratch. She was reclaiming herself, piece by quiet piece, from the rubble of what men and fear had tried to bury. And the rancher? He never reached to pull those pieces out of her. He just made sure no one else came close with a shovel. Some days they barely spoke. Others, they worked side by side for hours. There were still ghosts. Still shadows in corners neither of them dared to name aloud. But what mattered was this. They didn't fix each other. They simply chose not to walk away. And in a world that had once treated them both like afterthoughts, that choice was nothing short of sacred. The storm hit before sunrise. The wind came first, angry and uninvited, pushing its weight against the wooden walls of the house like some restless ghost. Snow followed, sharp and insistent, covering the fields faster than anyone could have prepared for. By dawn, the barn doors had frozen shut. Etta stood at the window wrapped in a worn quilt, watching as the world disappeared in white. The horizon, usually so clear and wide, had vanished behind a curtain of snow. "You ever get snow like this where you came from?" the rancher asked, stoking the stove. Etta shook her head. "We didn't stay long enough anywhere to notice the seasons." He nodded once, as if that explained something he'd always wondered but never asked. The storm trapped them for 3 days. No visitors, no chores beyond the essentials. Just heat from the stove, the scent of cedar smoke, and the quiet hum of shared space. On the second evening, they played cards on the kitchen table. She didn't know the rules, but he taught her without condescension. When she won her first hand, she raised her eyebrows like a challenge. "You're good," he admitted. "I'm dangerous," she smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her tease, truly tease. Not just polite laughter, but the spark of someone who had rediscovered the joy of playing. The house felt warmer than it should have, as if something other than firewood was fueling the room. On the third day, Etta opened the trunk at the foot of her bed. She hadn't touched it since the day she'd arrived. Inside were the clothes she came in, torn, dirt-stained, rough. She folded them slowly, gently, like handling the skin of her former self. Then she buried them at the bottom, beneath a wool shawl and a worn copy of a book she hadn't read in years. Later that night, she stood in front of the mirror, brush in hand. She hadn't braided her hair since she was a girl. Her fingers stumbled at first, memory not yet muscle. But after a while, the motion returned. Quiet. Natural. A rhythm from another time that hadn't died, only waited. She stepped out onto the porch in the hush of snowfall, moonlight making the drifts shimmer like broken glass. The braid down her back wasn't for beauty. It was a declaration. She wasn't hiding anymore. When the storm cleared, the sky opened with a sharp blue that made the snowfields glow. Everything was quiet and clean, and with that stillness came something else. Clarity. She began to walk further from the ranch, following fence lines out into the untouched snow. Not escaping, just exploring, reclaiming the space, learning the land not as a place she had to survive, but one she could belong to. One morning, she climbed the rise near the eastern pasture and stood there for a long time, watching the sun rise behind the hills. The cold bit her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. This was the first time she'd looked toward the horizon and felt like it might be hers. Then, in late January, a letter arrived. It bore no return address, only her name. Her real name. The one she hadn't said aloud in years. She stared at it on the table for almost an hour before opening it. The handwriting inside was jagged, almost frantic. A man's voice from her past. One of the names she had buried deep beneath silence and frost. He was alive. He had found her. And worse, he wanted to see her. She said nothing to the rancher for 2 days. Just folded the letter and tucked it between the pages of her journal. But something shifted in her presence. Not fear. Not exactly. More like a wind changing direction. He noticed. "You all right?" he asked one evening while cleaning his rifle. She nodded, then paused. "Someone from before wrote to me." He didn't ask who. He didn't ask what they wanted. He simply said, "Do you want to answer?" "I don't know," she whispered. And that was enough. The next morning, he left a saddlebag on the porch with a note tucked inside. "You can go if you need. But you never have to run again." She didn't go. Not yet. But she sat on the porch for a long time, fingers brushing the leather strap, the weight of that freedom resting on her lap like something sacred. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she found him standing by the barn, hands in his coat pockets, staring out at the land. "Why'd you leave it for me?" she asked, holding up the saddlebag. He shrugged gently. "Seemed like you deserved a choice." Etta stepped beside him, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. "I never had one before." He looked at her, quiet and certain. "You do now." And in that moment, she understood something she never had before, not even during the years she'd begged for freedom. Freedom isn't the absence of chains, it's the presence of choice. And she had finally, truly, been given one. He came in late afternoon, not announced, not invited, just rode up the path like nothing had ever broken. Etta saw him from the porch, same crooked posture, same hungry eyes scanning the land like it still owed him something. Time hadn't softened him. If anything, it had sharpened what was already cruel. He dismounted slow, casual, like he expected her to run out and fall at his feet. She didn't move. The rancher stepped out from the barn, shotgun in hand, not raised, just resting on his shoulder like a question waiting for an answer. The man laughed. "Ain't no need for that. I'm just here to talk to what's mine." Etta stood, walked down the steps. Not trembling, not angry, just calm. Cold as the snow still clinging to the fence posts. "You don't get to call me anything," she said, her voice low but clear. "Not girl. Not yours. Not even Etta." The man took a step toward her, and that was all it took. The rancher moved forward, quiet and certain. But she raised a hand, not to him, to the past. "I'm not scared of you anymore," she said. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She turned her back to the man and walked away. And in that moment, she didn't just leave him behind. She buried him, in the silence of a woman who had rebuilt herself brick by brick and no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. Some stories don't end with rescue. They begin with recognition. Etta was never truly saved the day she was bought. She was simply seen by someone who didn't need to own her to believe in her worth. What followed wasn't some miracle transformation, but the long, hard work of becoming, of rebuilding herself in the quiet, away from the eyes of those who had once named her less. It didn't happen overnight. It happened in silence, in space, in the dignity of being given the right to decide who she was without fear. And when her past came riding back, like a storm dressed in old skin and louder threats, she didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to fight like she once did, clawing to be believed. She had already won the moment she realized she could walk away without apologizing. Because survival is one kind of strength, but choosing peace over fear, choosing stillness over chaos, that's power. That's freedom. Etta's story isn't about a man saving a woman. It's about what happens when someone is finally given space to save herself. And in the wide, harsh silence of the West, where so many were buried beneath names they didn't choose, she rose. Not as someone's possession, but as her own. No longer looking back, only forward.